I'm Kathryn Jean Lopez from the National Review Institute, and I'm here with my good friend and our good friend, Naomi Schaefer Riley, who has a new article in National Review. She has articles in many places in the new year already, but she's in the historic Bill Buckley, our founder. It would be his 100th birthday this year. And so it's a historic issue talking about Bill Buckley. And we have a few other articles, and one of them is Children in Danger by Naomi. And I want you to talk a little bit about this. Naomi, you, first of all, have become really an expert on child welfare. You've really made it a priority. I want you to talk at a little bit about how you made that a priority and why you made that a priority. You, of course, you have a book called No Way to Treat a Child. And if you're watching this, if you're listening to this and you have not read the book, I would highly encourage you to do so. It is a rude awakening in many ways. But there's a chapter in there that is so encouraging as well. And I often tell people to skip to that chapter about wonderful people who are doing incredible work to literally save the lives of children, and to help support families who are trying to provide respite and forever homes. And there's so many layers to this issue. I also will get into this a little bit more. We want to mention the website Lives Cut Short, and you can talk about that a little bit. Naomi is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and that's a project of AEI and UNC Chapel Hill, right? Okay. So Naomi, why don't you start, before we get into the NR article and some other issues, why did this become such a priority for you? And the last better part of a decade now?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Kathryn. It's an honor to be with you, and it's especially an honor to be part of the 100th anniversary William F. Buckley issue. So I'm glad I
I'm
made
a
it
little
in.
jealous, I'll have to say.
When I was an intern working with you, who knows how many years ago, who would have imagined?
Yeah.
The way I got into child welfare, it was kind of like a number of different topics that I was interested in sort of came together. I published a book in 2016 called The New Trail of Tears, which was about American Indians, and I traveled across the country to different reservations and other tribal communities to try to understand what was going on in these communities. And one of the things that came up over and over again was some pretty horrific child welfare outcomes in these communities, very high levels of physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect. They were also experiencing very high levels of poverty and substance abuse. And the child welfare system did not seem to be serving these kids well. And I wanted to, when I came back from that trip, really start to understand what the rest of the child welfare system looks like. So I live outside of New York, and for many years I had followed some of the high profile child maltreatment fatalities that occurred here and some of the failures of the system that kept happening over and over again. And just, kept trying to figure out. I mean, I approached, many of our friends just who had been part of really great movements, I think, of ideas on the right, from school choice to, broken windows policing, like just trying to understand, like, what is the conservative response to the failures of child welfare? And I primarily got two responses. One was, this is kind of what happens when you have these two things, both the breakdown of the family and also a drug epidemic. And I thought that answer was very true. I probably think it's more true now than I did at the beginning when I was starting my research on this. But I also think it's very insufficient as an answer. There are hundreds of thousands of kids in our foster care system. There are hundreds of thousands of kids who are experiencing abuse and neglect every year. There are about 2,000 children who die of maltreatment fatalities every year by our best estimates. And so I think we need a better response. And I started delving into this more. I got in touch with Robert Dorr, who many of you know is the president of the American Enterprise Institute now, but he actually used to work under Mike Bloomberg, and one of the things that he oversaw was the Administration for Children's Services. So he, kind of understood the importance of this issue and also a little bit about how the system worked. And so I came to AEI in about 2018, thinking that really this is what I wanted to spend my time on. And so since then, I've really done a deep dive into foster care, family courts, adoption, trying to understand the impact of the drug crisis on these kids. And also, as you mentioned, really looking in depth at how, different faith and civic organizations are working to, help struggling families, to foster, kids who are in danger, to, adopt when that's an option, and, really trying to get the full picture for what this looks like across the country.
And one of the things you just mentioned is the nonprofit groups, the faith-based ministries who are working on the ground. And one of the things that you write about, you speak about, is the obstacles that are sometimes put in the way to the faith-based organizations. And also, I just want to note the challenge of doing that deep dive is regulations and laws are different everywhere. Obviously, you have some things in common, but it does take a lot of work, and I think it's often thankless work. But people who are advocating for these children are grateful to you, I know, because I hear from them. But that answer that you mentioned is insufficient, and as people know, I'm a big pro-life advocate, and it's not sufficient, of course. There's this, we usually call it a lazy assumption that lazy slander has been used, that pro-lifers only care for children when they're born. We just want them to be born and then forget it. And there's something to that sometimes. If pro-lifers aren't considering this a top tier issue, we're not doing our jobs. And in addition to that, you don't have to talk about abortion in this conversation. This is an issue that should bring people together. Whatever we care about children. We can put that aside and have a conversation about the children who are alive and whose lives are in danger. And Naomi, that gets us to the article in National Review in our February issue. We're both New Yorkers, and New York is the opening for your piece, unfortunately. Talk about the young man who died, not the young man, the child, who was malnourished, and just tell us the story a little bit.
Yeah, so late last year, we heard of the tragedy of Jameek Modlin. He was only 4 years old when he was found basically on the edge of death in his apartment. He was subsequently pronounced dead at the hospital of malnourishment. He had three older siblings, ages 5, 6, and 7, who were also found severely malnourished in that apartment. There was a history with the Administration for Children's Services in New York with this family. The details about what was happening in this apartment are just nauseating. The apartment, had a refrigerator that was fully stocked with food, but it was turned around so that these small children could not access the food in it.
And that's the kind of image that we can't unknow,
No,
Yeah.
you absolutely cannot know it. And I think it's significant for a variety of reasons. I mean, we have had over the last number of years, over and over, New Yorkers have heard about kids who have died, who the Administration for Children's Services knew about, had launched multiple investigations. And when I tell you that most of the child maltreatment fatalities in this country happen in families that are known to us.
Mhm.
I know that some of the cases that make the headlines, a few years ago, we had that horrible case of the Turpin family out in California where the kids were locked in the house and the neighbors said we had no idea what was going on. Those are the exceptions.
Mhm.
In most of these cases, we know that something is going wrong in these families and we are making some bad decisions about what to do about it. I think, those bad decisions are happening for a couple of reasons we can get into. But the reason that I want to focus on the refrigerator, because one of the first stories I read about this case was on WPIX, which many New Yorkers will know is kind of a local television network, but they have a website. And at the bottom of the article, they mentioned that you can call a hotline um, if you want to access food or a soup kitchen. And I just thought of all of the bizarre things that you could offer, in this case, the idea that what this family, needed was somehow access to food was so beyond outrageous. But when they interviewed a variety of experts about this, all they could talk about was families, need resources. They need to know where to turn to get food or housing. They need to have more connections to other people. And I just thought, you know what? The folks involved here are, you have two adults living in this home. There is clearly some kind of severe mental illness, substance abuse, or something that is going on in these people's heads that you could
And
have
often a combination of all of those.
absolutely, that you could have four children living there with a refrigerator turned around like this. What these people needed was not access to a soup kitchen.
Mhm. And you also talk about in the article, there's this program in New York, the CARES program, Collaborative Assessment, Response, Engagement, and Support.
Yes.
And it's kind of doing the opposite of what you would want.
Right. So, like many agencies, and I maybe should have said at the outset, you sort of mentioned that across the country there are all different regulations. Child welfare is a state-run enterprise. About half of the money comes from the federal government, but states are making their own policies. A lot of states have county-run systems, so counties are making their own policies. In New York, of course, the city has its own agency. But across these different agencies, you find certain commonalities. And one of the trends in the last number of years has been toward diverting families out of kind of official investigations and pointing them more toward supports. So the idea is that what these families need is not the intervention of authorities or law enforcement. They don't need investigations to find out what goes on there. What they need is the supports. And over the last couple of years, I've actually had the opportunity to talk to a whistleblower at ACS who was deeply concerned about families that are being diverted from CARES into the CARES program, families that have serious drug abuse problems, for instance. And the way CARES is described is that it is supposed to, quote, combat racial disparities, promote social justice, and it's supposed to, quote, encourage families to develop their own solutions to their challenges. The CARES, they've also started to change the standards for what merits an actual investigation or what goes into CARES. So, for instance, parental criminal activity now does not merit a child welfare investigation necessarily. Parental drug abuse does not merit necessarily an investigation. These can go into CARES where, presumably the drug abusing parents can come up with their own ideas for how best to solve their problems. So I think this is a very dangerous trend. A lot of other people in New York have also suggested this. There's someone who talks regularly on New York One, which is our another local television station, about the dangers of this. Other reporters and opinion writers have pointed to the problems with this. And I think a lot of people are a little bit even surprised that the head of ACS seems to keep doubling down on this strategy despite tragedy after tragedy that is occurring.
And in so many cases, you know, around the country, when a fatality happens, there isn't the review and the coming clean about what went wrong. And part of what you're trying to direct people toward is if you actually took a look at what went into the deaths, we would see that it's built into the system.
Yeah.
And what is preventing Child Protective Services in various places from doing that?
So, unfortunately, this is an issue that sometimes gets a brief moment of the public's attention and then doesn't get any sustained review. So, as you mentioned, we have this new project we've launched called Lives Cut Short. You can go to our website, livescutshort.org. It's a project of AEI and UNC Chapel Hill. We're trying to document child maltreatment fatalities. So, all fatalities that result from abuse or neglect. And we think that the federal government, first of all, and state governments are undercounting these numbers. So we started with just media reports, and in some states, just using media reports, we came up with more fatalities than that state was reporting.
Wow.
We've also now recently moved into looking at medical examiner records. So that would be different than sometimes what a child welfare agency is doing. But local medical examiners, they're just sort of doing their job and they're offering these reports. And one thing that we see is sometimes those deaths are actually getting mischaracterized. Sometimes they're being characterized as accidents, like, a 1-year-old who is overdosed on fentanyl. You could call that an accident in the sense that presumably the parent did not intend for that to happen, but it also suggests that it is not, this was not natural causes, and something seriously wrong is going on in that household if a 1-year-old has access to fentanyl. So I think, what we're hoping to do is really shine more of a light on what is happening in these circumstances. Another pattern that we've seen a lot is parents who are using drugs or alcohol often are, the children are suffering sleep deaths as a result. Parents are rolling over on their children and they're too intoxicated to know. So another thing that could be characterized, again, officially as an accident. But obviously, you would want to know that that was happening in your county. And if you were, for instance, an agency that was investigating this family and had already found out that the parents had a serious substance abuse problem, this might be one kind of natural consequence of you not doing enough to make sure that that parent got the help that they needed to get sober. So, in terms of why we're not focused enough, I think, parents, I think the general public, they get outraged by the death, but there's not a lot of follow-up.
Right.
But also often the agencies are not, or they're not required, or they don't think they're required to share this information with the public. Again, to get back to New York, because I think it's a good example of this. Jess Danhauser, who is the ACS director, said, I don't believe that discussing the details of individuals' families' lives is the best way to drive system change when it's important, when the public needs to know if we get something terribly wrong. I'll make sure they know. So, you'll excuse me for not believing any public official who says
All
that.
right.
So there are important transparency laws on the books in most states. If you go to our website, you can see sort of states that we've highlighted as being particularly good at certain aspects of this. Florida, for instance, is one of them, where they're releasing very extensive reports on these maltreatment fatalities, both so you can see the patterns of what's happening, also so you can see where the failures are, because sometimes it's not just child welfare agencies. Sometimes there's law enforcement involved and there's a failure there. Sometimes medical professionals should have been reporting something and they did not. But until we sort of really take all of these cases and do a deep dive and understand them, we're not going to understand the system failures that are behind these tragedies.
One of the things you mentioned too in the National Review article is that some of these agencies are concerned, government agencies are concerned about being accused of being overzealous, of having lawsuits against them, because of racial disparity, because often it is Black children who are suffering the most from these fatalities and terrible situations. Um, but they're seeing lawsuits now because of the fatalities that are coming because they're trying not to be overzealous. So one of the things you say is, you mentioned Al Sharpton in the article for one. Is it Pollyannish to think a tide is turning, or is that possible?
So, I mean, I think all of the pressure in the last number of years has really come from folks who want child welfare to back off, to who say, oh, you're investigating too many families, you're removing too many children, you're coercing parents into services. I think this is coming from a variety of different audiences. It's coming both from progressives who are more concerned about the racial disparities. It's in some cases coming from sort of more libertarians, sometimes more religious conservatives who are, very concerned just, legitimately often about government overreach. Like these people are, they're telling me I can't homeschool. They're telling me I can't do all these other things with my kids. And so there's always a legitimate reason to be suspicious of government intervention in families. But I think all of the voices have been coming from there recently. And I don't think that that a lot of those folks, even I think, some of those folks are kind of unaware of what the actual statistics show. So, for instance, you see these, the stories about the free range parents who are, who let their kid walk to the store and then the kid was, picked up by CPS or something like that.
Right.
Those stories definitely happen. They've been happening for, well over a decade now. Um, they're just not anywhere near the majority of these cases or even a significant number of these cases, especially when you look at, maltreatment fatalities, but even when you, look at just any kind of serious abuse or neglect, the kids who are disproportionately represented are kids under the age of 3. These are not kids who are walking to the supermarket by themselves. And moreover, most of the free range parents, are not, using fentanyl while their kids are walking to the supermarket. So again, the prevalence of substance abuse in these cases also should be a tip off that the some of the cases that make the headlines, and sort of evoke the sympathy of a lot of middle class parents who are worried about the decisions they're making for their kids, those cases are not representative. So I just, want to throw that in there. But in terms of, so I think a lot of the legal pressure, a lot of the political pressure was really sort of pushing people more for child welfare agencies to step away. And now what you're seeing is the relatives of children who are victims have started to come forward and they have started to sue. They have said, this is an agency that knew what was going on. In many cases, these relatives were actually themselves making calls to
Mm.
Child Protective Services and being ignored. I mean, the outrage that there's a case in California of a young, I think it was 8-year-old girl who was murdered by her mother and her mother's boyfriend. The grandmother and the aunt were calling regularly to to talk about how this child needed to be rescued, how this situation, the mother was unstable, that they had lots of evidence of this, and so they're trying to hold the agencies responsible for dereliction of their duty. And I think, look, there's going to be a limited number of these lawsuits, but I think at some point, this might be the only way to really hold some of these agencies accountable. I mean, I would love for more legislators to get involved. I would love to see more oversight from county boards. I'd love to see more political leaders speak out about this. But I think time and again, it seems like there's not the appetite for that in a lot of these cases. And so the relatives of the victims, I think, have a role here to play, especially if they have been, out there trying to blow the whistle themselves.
And you mentioned how state officials, in particular legislators, can have hearings on the local level when a child dies to really investigate. They have that power.
Yeah.
There should be more of that. You mentioned we were talking about the website, Lives Cut Short. How can normal people who aren't activists make use. Obviously, activists can definitely make use of this resource, incredible resource, really. How can average people take a look at that and do something with it?
So I will definitely tell people, you should, if you see one of these deaths, you should be encouraging your legislators. Utah, for instance, just had a case, a tragic case of a boy named Gavin Peterson, who was 12, and I mean, just starved and tortured for years. I cannot describe it in any other way, but I encourage you to look him up and understand what happened to this boy, whose family had been in regular contact with Child Protective Services, who, when he went to school, cafeteria workers were trying to feed him food because he was taking food out of the garbage can. And when those cafeteria workers, bravely called CPS and said something needs to be done, those parents took him out of school, and decided that they were going to quote unquote homeschool him, I guess. But there was no sense of, this is a family that we've already found to be abusing and neglecting a child, and now they've decided he can't attend school anymore, and we know he was digging food out of the garbage and looked like he was starving. So people were outraged, and Utah's legislative committee that oversees child welfare has held hearings on this to find out, to try to get to the bottom of it and what went wrong. So I would encourage people to do that. If you see a case in the news that you think is worthy of understanding better what went wrong, the legislatures and the governor's office, can exercise oversight here. What we've seen with Lives Cut Short, we've gotten some really great and helpful responses. So we have people who've contacted us just saying, I know of a case that's not in your database yet. And
Mm.
so, if that is true, I think it's really important. I mean, we are putting up, the children's names and ages because we think it is really important. These children were forgotten, they were mistreated during their lifetimes, and we think it's important that their names be up there now, to serve as a memory, to be, to encourage us to do better. So we're definitely encouraging a lot of, people to help from the outside. And there's a search bar that you can look up, the cases in your state. So you can look through, and we've included links for each child, either to an official report that's coming from the state government, or to a media report, or both. So you can get a lot of information on that child, and you can really, I think, I just, encourage people to go to this website, because I think, you can look by age and you can start to see yourself. You don't need to be an expert, but you can start to see the patterns yourself. You can see, how prevalent substance abuse is in these cases. You can see how frequently boyfriends of mothers are involved in these incidents. You can see how young the children are. I mean, the number of children under the age of 1, who have suffered these fatalities, I think should just really, it just breaks the heart of everyone, I think, who looks at these statistics. So that's what I would encourage people who want to understand more to do.
Some people who have listened to some of our conversations and some of NRI's conversations, more broadly on adoption and foster care know this, but I have a godson who, in the first month of his life, was smothered by his birth mother. He, of course, was born with all kinds of drugs in his system, smothered to the extent that he had no vital signs and was in the emergency room. And this is not a one-off thing. This is not something that's rare. And one of the things, first of all, I want to mention, some people have already, if you are watching this live and want to ask a question, please put it in the chat box. Also, we have a link to Lives Cut Short, the website. And Naomi, one of the things that you write about in the NR piece and elsewhere is how we tend to, or Child Protective Services, rather, and maybe the media too, tend to, well, the media demonize, the government agencies infantilize a lot of these parents who are you write about baby Phoenix in Santa Clara, California, who died of a drug overdose because they put him back with a father who had a criminal record in drugs. It is like people who are making these policies have no idea what being in the throes of addiction is like. You talked earlier about how in New York they're saying, oh, come up with a plan that you can better your life. They're in the throes of addiction and maybe crime and all these things. In the best of circumstances, you can't just say, hey, figure it out. It's cruel. Both honestly to the parent who's suffering, and obviously there are choices that are made and all of these things, but and brutally cruel to the children, barbarically cruel in many of these cases. Why is that? Is it just, I often think in terms of adoption and foster care and children who are stuck in the system, and some of these terrible stories that unfortunately are more common than not. When I read about religious persecution, it's just like, it's a bummer of a story. It's terrible that it's happening, that people are tortured or killed to go to church or temple or, but what can I do about it? I really don't want to think about it. I have problems of my own, right? That's kind of the attitude. And I understand because it can be overwhelming. And then you start doom scrolling all these stories, right? But we have to. We owe these children something. And that's how do you kind of convey the ownership we really have to have over this issue, over these young lives who are, I do think it's so important that you tell the stories, that you let people know the names, that you see the faces where possible and appropriate. It's always dangerous to bring up the Holocaust, but I love what the Auschwitz Memorial does on social media. They show you pictures of people who were killed in the Holocaust. This is not just statistics. These are real people, beautiful children, beautiful, talented people. And so to know that, this child who never had a shot because the people who were supposed to help them didn't, and we're not holding them to account, and we're not doing anything. How do you convey that message in an encouraging way, in a way that people feel like they really can contribute to this?
So I just want to get back to something you mentioned at the beginning, which was the question of addiction here, I think, is so important. You ask, how could they possibly think that, someone who's in the throes of addiction is going to come up with a plan for themselves? I mean, I think this is obviously a larger cultural message here. And, child welfare is in some sense, it's always the product of all sorts of these cultural trends, whether it's, the constant concern about racial disparities, or, the sort of current idea, which is that drug use is a lifestyle choice. And that, adults can legitimately decide they just want to use drugs, and that's fine. And you will hear, social workers, child welfare caseworkers, talk about, well, when that mother decides that she is going to use cocaine, she can just drop off this child with her aunt or her grandmother or something like that. And it's just an amazing disconnection from reality that is going on in these instances, but they're definitely getting it from somewhere. I mean, you get this sense that people really think drug use in these instances is quite manageable, that we're all adults here and we might make different choices for how to lead our lives. But I really I think of these situations, even when we have gone this far toward legalization, we still have some important rules on the books. You can't, You can't be a pilot trying to fly a plane while you're high. You can't be doing surgery while you're high. And I would argue it's really hard to parent a 6-month-old while you're high. I would argue it's really hard to parent a 6-month-old while you're sober too. Um,
Right.
but just, sort of reinforcing these basic ideas about the importance of sobriety for children's safety is a really important factor that we're missing. So to get to your question about like how do you sort of get to the point where people are not so overwhelmed? I mean, obviously, I think that whole motto about acting locally, I think is just really important. Like, what can you do in your own community? I think, rather than scrolling maybe through every single name on Lives Cut Short, put in your own state, like try to understand what's happening in your own county, to kids of a particular age, maybe, and then try to find, organizations in your community that are supporting, maybe parents who are at risk of having their kids removed, maybe supporting foster parents, maybe fostering yourself, trying to provide kids with, a safe environment, while their parents are rehabilitated, for instance. I actually did another piece for NR a few months ago, which might interest people because some of the pushback I, immediately get is, foster care is the worst thing ever. And obviously, in this context, you can't possibly think foster care is the worst thing ever because these kids have died at the hands of their parents. But there's actually really interesting research that within certain margins, foster care really has big benefits for kids. That, if you are a kid on the margin where you might be removed or you might not be removed, there's research that suggests that removal might actually give your parents the chance to really get their act together, and that removal might be the signal that the parents need to actually do that. That, expecting that parents are going to just change their ways after years and years of drug abuse, neglecting kids, putting kids in unsafe situations, maybe they do need a wake-up call. And the effects are really interesting. I mean, better outcomes in terms of adult criminal activity for the parents and for the kids when they grow up, better educational outcomes for the kids. This is all for, what are mostly short stays in foster care. And so just trying to understand that, yes, there are going to be trade-offs with all of these options, but trying to understand that we do need to be putting kids at the center of this decision making and asking, what is going to be the safe place for them, and how can we make sure that either their parents get their acts together so that they can be safe, or that we find them a place where they can be safe in the long term.
And there's also a way not only for people to provide respite care, but to be advocates for the children in courts.
Yeah.
And
No, I mean, CASA is another thing, court-appointed special advocates. For people who just, don't really know anything about child welfare, I'd encourage that experience. You usually get paired with one child, often over the course of, up to a year or even longer, where you really sort of see the ins and outs of what's going on with that child and their biological family, maybe with a foster family. And you also see how our family courts operate, often for better or worse. So I think it gives you a little bit more of a bird's eye view. But from my perspective, I also think that CASAs serve an important role in the institution of child welfare because these are sort of outsiders. They're not trained by agencies. They're not as subject to kind of the trends and the whims of what happens in child welfare. They're quite sensible people often who just think, wow, I can't believe this is happening. This is outrageous. And I think we need more eyes on the system. And getting your legislator to hold hearings is a very high bar. But being the person in the courtroom that's representing the interest of the child, I think is something that individuals can do.
And in many contexts, it's that human encounter at the end of the day that's going to make the difference. We can't overhaul the system as individuals, but we can influence someone's life and help someone's life. And we're talking about young children, but you kind of touched on it a few moments ago when you talked about children who later on don't necessarily have a life of crime because their lives were changed by a positive experience in the foster care system, whether they wound up back with their biological parents or not. And one of the issues that so infrequently is talked about is the children who age out of the foster care system, never get into a home, or were bounced around in homes. And yeah, they want to get arrested because it gives them some stability and food and a cot and all the rest. And that shouldn't be happening in America. In our chat box, we have a little window into some of the contentious debate that happens on these issues. Yes, it is a trauma to take a child away from their biological parent. Sometimes it has to happen. Our friend Darcy Olin at Generation Justice, although it's changed its name, but if you Google
The
Darcy
Center for
Olin,
the Rights of Abused Children.
thank you, thank you. Often makes this point: if you're addicted to meth and you're a single mom, this isn't going to work. She thinks that the child needs to be taken away automatically, and that sounds cruel. But are we putting the child first, or are we putting the parent first? And obviously, we want to get that parent help, but we need to protect the child. Why is this kinship issue so contentious? And you wrote recently, was it in you wrote a piece for City Journal, I think, in the last day or so, where it talked about how if you have some kind of blood connection, the standards are lower. And sometimes there is this search for anyone who may have never met the child but has a connection, and that can be dangerous as well.
So I wrote this piece. I mean, I think something that a lot of people don't realize is that every child welfare agency in the country gives preference to kin. I mean, it's the easiest thing and really the best thing, all things being equal, for kids and for families. You know, if you want to place the child with ideally someone they know, you want to place the child with, somebody who's in the area, you want to place the child with someone who cares about the child, obviously. And so, kinship is sort of the obvious answer. Now, that happens in a variety of ways, even outside of the child welfare system. If something is happening to a mother, even before child welfare gets involved, a grandmother might step in and say, I need to take that child because you're strung out on drugs and you need to go get help. And sometimes that happens entirely outside of the child welfare system. But once the child welfare system gets involved, then the government's responsibility is to find a safe and appropriate place for that child to be. And so, then the question is, generally still the preference is for kin, but we also have non-relatives who could be candidates for foster children. And so the question is, how do you sort of weigh these different people who could be placements for a child? And in the last couple of years, the Biden administration has encouraged states through a rule that was, created at HHS, to create a kind of different pathway to license relative foster parents. So a lot of relative foster parents, say they would like to be able to access the same stipends that non-relatives have, and I think there's a lot of good reason for that. I mean, we to pay non-relatives, but not to pay relatives who are doing the exact same thing. And many times, of course, the relatives have a lot of financial need, and they didn't expect to take in a child at the last minute. Maybe their grandparents who've already retired or something like that. So there is good reason to, to think, okay, well, they should be getting the same benefits. But the question is, should they be able to take an alternative pathway to get to licensing? And so the arguments that were made were, relative caregivers might not have the same number of bedrooms that are required. And are we really going to say that the grandson shouldn't just sleep on the couch to stay in the grandmother's, and that we're going to put him with a stranger just because the grandmother didn't have an extra bedroom? No, I mean, I think that there are, reasonable things you could say are kind of bureaucratic foster care rules. But I think actually, there's good reason to look at those rules throughout the system and ask yourself, like, there was a rule I think Michigan had a few years ago that said, you couldn't have a foster child in within a certain number of feet of farm equipment. And so, both for non-relatives and relatives, why is this a rule? Let's look at the rules and ask ourselves. But I think what was really at the heart of this was that a lot of relatives were not passing background checks when it came to foster care licensing. They were not passing criminal background checks. And we obviously think that those can be very important red flags, and they are certainly going to remain in place for non-relatives. So the question is, are you now using this alternative pathway to create a workaround so that kin with criminal backgrounds can now care for their relative children in foster care, and also receive money from the government for doing it? And I think that's a real problem. And so what you saw, sorry for this long explanation, but what you saw in Illinois in the last few weeks is they were one of the first states to pass a law, or they've almost passed the law. It's passed the House, and I think it's now in front of the Senate, that would change, offer an alternative pathway for licensing relatives. And one of the first things they said was, we are going to change the rules about criminal background checks, because we think that the state should take into consideration the overrepresentation of minorities, racial minorities, in the criminal justice system when they are deciding whether to license this particular foster parent. And I have to say, I don't see the relevance. Like, I really think we need to be looking at this child, where the best placement is for them. If that, if it turns out that that relative foster parent, was picked up for smoking marijuana 30 years ago, and we don't think that it's a problem, I don't know why that's a problem for a non-relative either. But, we can look at that. But the idea that we are taking into consideration the representation of different racial groups in the criminal justice system to determine the best placement for a child is crazy. And it was clear to me at the time that the Biden administration first started talking about this, that was the issue. And they kept insisting, no, it's just all of these other rules that we want to deal with. No, it turns out that they really want to lower the standards of safety when it comes to kin placements.
Whatever one thinks of the new administration, you and I were both in a session or two where the domestic policy shop, first time around, in the Trump administration, was trying to shine a light and trying to do something constructive. Is there anything that the new administration can do that you would want them to prioritize on this front?
Well, I don't want them to undo this rule,
Yeah.
to start with, but there are other rules that have been passed by the last administration that I think are the current administration, which are concerning. You had rules around requirements for faith-based organizations were going to, the initial rule was that faith-based organizations had to support LGBTQ kids in a particular way that involved supporting gender transitions and hormone therapy and calling people by other names and all sorts of things like that. They backed off from that a little bit and changed it so that what they required was that agencies have a kind of array of people who included people who would do that. But it really sort of put a thumb on the scale still, even though it did not actually require religious agencies to do things that violated their faith. It did put them in a situation where the public agencies they were contracting with would be less likely to use them because there were all sorts of requirements that they had to fulfill that the religious agencies were not going to be able to do for them. I think this administration has really gone to great lengths to make it harder for religious foster care and adoption agencies to operate, and I would love to see that change. Maybe a new administration will help that along. We are really trying with the Lives Cut Short project to get more attention both from federal and state governments on the issue of child maltreatment fatalities. And finally, one thing I think they could do is just stop issuing insane pronouncements. I mean, you had a commissioner under the Biden administration maybe 2 or 3 years ago, who, issued a statement, comparing Child Protective Services, in people who work for them to plantation owners. And warning people not to call CPS because, who knows, what kinds of terrible things would happen to Black children if you did that. And I just, a lot of, like I said, child welfare is a very state-run institution. But like so many things with the federal government, like education, for instance, there is a bully pulpit there, that I think has been misused in a lot of ways by this administration.
And you mentioned some of the hyper contentious issues like transgender issues with children and confusion. And first of all, so many of these children, because of the trauma that they've gone through, are added confused, in addition to the confusion that children always have, right? And especially as they become teenagers. But what's so maddening is that in so many of these cases, like the Philadelphia case that went to the Supreme Court with Catholic Social Services, it was a theoretical question about, in that case, the gay couple, if they happen to go to Catholic Social Services. We're seeing more often than not couples who maybe are the grandparents of a child, mother of the grandchild who is addicted to drugs or whatever the problem is, and they're being asked questions like, if this child is 7 and decides that she's a boy, what will you do? And they have to pass that litmus test. It's just so clearly ideological, because we're dealing with theoretical questions, and they're not putting the children first. And that's what we have to do. There's someone who asked a question, as you've gathered the accounts of children who have lost their lives, have you seen many cases with indications that children may have witnessed domestic violence or intimate partner violence in their homes? Of course, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of I think the biggest, the most sort of contentious issues, one of the myths that you hear so often about child maltreatment is that there's this thing called neglect, and it's not really a big deal. That it's neglect is just poverty, again, to get back to, they just need access to a soup kitchen. People don't realize what neglect encompasses, but one of the things that most state statutes of neglect include is witnessing domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And so understanding that that is a factor in these cases. There was an interesting study that looked at, I think, about 500, actually read through 500 cases in California of things that were classified as neglect. And in 99% of them, they involved substance abuse, and or domestic violence. I mean, those were some of the things that were underlying it. And in 99% of the cases, the physical, just needing stuff was never the thing that prompted this finding. It was not, this. We recently had a congressman who actually claimed that in his state, kids were being removed from their homes because they lacked winter coats. I defy anybody to find a case of a child who was put into foster care because this was the reason, because they needed a winter coat. I mean, the slanders, you would think that child welfare agencies would want to object more to this. The slander that these people, whatever their level of education and training is, that instead of just dropping by the Salvation Army and getting this kid a coat, that they would say, the only solution is foster care. I mean, I think we need to give them a little bit more credit. I mean, I criticize them a lot, but I think that's a little bit absurd.
And when you look at the big picture, one of the things that people need to understand, and a lot of there's evangelical movements that have really taken this to heart. While there are one child in the child welfare system is too many, but this is a doable number. If we actually cared about these kids, we could get them into homes. We could get some of the parents the support they need. what is it going to do? What is it going to take to have that tide turn? And we really take ownership of, again, take ownership of this issue that is at the core of, people told John Meacham, and people talk about the soul of America. Well, if America has a soul, this is something that requires an examination of conscience.
So, I mean, look, I think there has really been, a revolution in terms of what especially large evangelical churches, but a lot of other churches have really been interested in doing, and the things that they have already done to help kids and families in these situations. They are training and recruiting and supporting foster families in ways that you just did not see 15 or 20 years ago. So I think they deserve, a huge shout out for the work that they're doing. But this work, has to be done, together with government agencies, because, there is a role, the government is the one who gets to decide, whether or not that child is safe in their home. And unfortunately, a lot of these agencies are actually sort of suggesting we don't need foster families. At one point, a couple of years ago, New Jersey announced we're not recruiting foster parents anymore. And there is just such I think, a sense of like, foster parents are they're not only are they not needed, but they're really a part of the problem. And so to the extent that that message is out there and this whole movement to abolish child welfare and all this, I think, people internalize that message. And even if you are part of a church that is foster friendly or interested in that, you don't want to be part of the problem. Who wants to be part of the
Right.
problem? So I think, we also, churches, there's a reluctance to get too involved in public policy because you want to sort of say, look, we're just here to help, and I think that's very reasonable. You don't want to get involved in all of these public policy conflicts because in sometimes it might damage your ability to do the help that you want. But that being said, I do think that there is a role for religious organizations to understand what the policies are and why all this work that they're doing to recruit foster families and to support foster families might be all for naught if the government announces, oh, hey, we don't like foster care anymore at all, and we're just going to leave kids in unsafe homes.
Um, I am sorry to say that we're running out of time, and I want to be conscious of everyone's time. Naomi, thank you for this. One person does mention in some states there are ombudsmen essentially for child protective services. So if you see something, say something, as they say. And there are so many, again, so many layers to this, so many conversations to have. But one thing I'd encourage you, if you are on social media, follow Naomi Schaefer Riley's X account because you do a great job of putting key articles up and sharing them with people. And I should give a shout out. We were talking about evangelicals. Our friend Jed Medfin at the Christian Alliance for Orphans has a great article in Christianity Today about the orphan care movement and sort of its maturation over the years. And CAFO is a great resource as well if people are looking for something to do or just to understand what can be done on an individual level a little bit more. And also, Naomi, you've been a great advocate for foster kids, foster parents, yes, foster kids, children at risk, but foster parents in particular who want to help. But yeah, get a lot of grief often, maybe because of racial issues, because they're not the same race as the child, or other issues. And yeah, we have, those outlier stories about nightmarish parents, foster parents who just wanted the very minuscule amount of money, but money is that much of an issue that it matters. But in so many cases, there are people who want to help children and want to open their hearts and their homes, which is such a difficult thing to do for many reasons that are another discussion. But they know it's the right thing to do, and they have the love that is necessary. But there are so many obstacles and such a lack of support and just sort of a caricature too of foster parents. So thank you for what you do to try to change the culture in all these different ways. Any last words?
No, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. And yeah, people want to reach out to me on social media or through AEI's website. I'm happy to engage on these topics anytime.
And again, livescutshort.org
Please,
the
please visit us.
website.
Yes.
Share it with people. You never know what comes of it. And thank you. So many people. I've seen names that I recognize of child welfare advocates. Thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for taking the time. And please do share this conversation, and please feel free to share feedback too offline with Naomi or myself. Lopez@nationalreview.com, and I'm on social media as well. So thank you on behalf of the National Review Institute, Naomi, and everyone who's
Thank
joined
you.
us or who will join us after the fact. I'm sure we'll have more conversations like this. Thank you again for your time. Bye.
Definitely. Thanks.